Imagine climbing into a warplane so dangerous that before you could even land it, you had to fire its propeller off into the sky and hope it drifted safely to the ground under a little parachute. No wheels, no second chances, no way back if you made a mistake. That wasn't a scene from a science fiction novel. It was an actual Nazi design project during World War II. And the strangest part? The Luftwaffe almost took it seriously. This wasn't just a plane, it was a flying coffin with wings, known as the Hüter HU-136. Some call it bold, others call it insane. The truth lies somewhere in between. But why would the Nazis even consider building something this reckless? And what kind of mind thought this was a good idea? Let's rewind to the late 1930s, because the story of the HU-136 begins in a moment of global tension, desperation, and wild ambition. The birth of a strange idea. The year was 1938. Europe stood on the edge of a conflict that would soon explode into the most destructive war in history. Inside the Reich Aviation Ministry, pressure was mounting. Germany's enemies were arming themselves faster than ever, and the Luftwaffe was desperate for new weapons, machines that could turn the tide before war even began. One request in particular stood out. The military wanted a ground attack aircraft. Not just any attacker, but something tough enough to withstand enemy fire, powerful enough to destroy tanks, and small enough to maneuver close to the battlefield. A flying tank, a warplane that could dive in, unleash devastation, and come out alive. Enter the Hüter brothers, two men known not for bombers or fighters, but for gliders, sleek, silent sailplanes that floated gracefully through the air. Hardly the resume you'd expect for the creators of a brutal frontline weapon. Yet when the call came for innovation, they volunteered. For them, this wasn't just about war. It was about breaking the rules of flight itself. No wheels, no big canopy, no compromise. Their vision was radical. Fuse the DNA of a glider with the armor of a tank, creating something small, indestructible, and utterly unique. The project was given a code name, Ostmark, and on their drawing board, a monstrous shape began to emerge, something that looked less like a plane and more like an armored torpedo with wings. The Hüter brothers weren't aiming for beauty, they were aiming for survival. But in their quest to reinvent the warplane, they came dangerously close to creating one of the most grotesque and impractical aircraft designs of the entire war. The insane design. At first glance, the Hüter HU-136 didn't look like any warplane you've ever seen. Forget the sleek curves of a Spitfire or the deadly lines of a Messerschmitt. This thing looked like an armored torpedo with wings, short, stubby, and brutally compact. A flying anvil, some would later call it. Under its nose sat a Daimler-Benz DB601 engine, the same powerful V12 that gave legendary fighters like the Bf-109 their edge. 1,200 horsepower, liquid-cooled, reliable and tested. On paper, it sounded like a winning start. But then you looked at the rest of the design. The entire aircraft measured just over 7 meters in length, with a wingspan barely reaching 6.5 meters. That's smaller than many fighter planes of the era. Yet somehow this little beast weighed nearly 3,700 kilograms, more than enough to drag its performance straight into the mud. Why so heavy? Armor plating, bomb racks, and above all, an obsession with survivability that ignored almost everything else. But here's where the madness truly began. The cockpit was shoved all the way to the rear of the fuselage. The pilot wasn't sitting up front like in every other aircraft. He was buried inside a steel cocoon at the back with almost no visibility. No glass canopy, no panoramic view, just a narrow slit at the nose and two tiny side holes. Flying it would have felt less like piloting an aircraft and more like trying to steer a submarine through the sky. And yet, the Hüter brothers believed in their vision. They thought this blind armored capsule would protect the pilot and keep the aircraft alive under enemy fire. What they created instead was an idea so radical that it teetered between genius and total disaster. Because if you can't see the battlefield, can you really fight on it? No landing gear, no mercy. As if flying blind wasn't bad enough, the Hüter brothers made another radical decision. The HU-136 wouldn't even have landing gear. No wheels. No standard undercarriage. Nothing. Instead, takeoff was handled by a detachable trolley. The plane would sit on the wheeled cart, roar down the runway, and once airborne, the trolley would drop away, left behind on the ground. It was unconventional, but not completely unheard of. Other experimental aircraft tried similar tricks. But the landing system? That was something else entirely. To touch down, the pilot had to do something no sane designer would ever demand: eject the propeller. Yes, really. Just before landing, the massive prop would fire forward off the aircraft, drifting back to Earth beneath a little parachute. The idea was that it could be recovered and reused. Meanwhile, the plane itself would slam down onto a retractable skid, like a steel sled dragging across the ground. Sounds risky? That doesn't even begin to cover it. Once that propeller was gone, there was no turning back. No go-arounds, no second chances. The pilot had one shot at landing, and it had to be perfect every single time. One mistake, and the aircraft and its crew were finished. In essence, the HU-136 was a one-way ticket. Every flight was a gamble. Takeoff was strange, flying was dangerous, and landing was practically a death wish. And yet, this wasn't some sketch in a notebook. This was a real prototype, backed by the Reich Aviation Ministry, developed as a serious contender for Germany's next frontline attack aircraft. But insane as this was, the Hüters weren't finished. Because once they strapped bombs and guns onto this thing, the risks became even higher. Firepower and ambition. For all its bizarre engineering choices, the HU-136 wasn't meant to be harmless. The Hüter brothers envisioned it as a brutal ground attacker, something that could punch holes in tanks, shred columns of vehicles, and terrify enemy troops. And on paper, the firepower looked promising. The first prototype, nicknamed Stubo-1, carried a single 500-kilogram bomb slung beneath the fuselage. That alone was enough to flatten a building or blow open a heavily armored position. Alongside the bomb, it likely packed 2 or 3 machine guns, though their exact placement is still debated. Some sources suggest one firing through the propeller, with others embedded in the engine cowling above. Whatever the layout, the concept was clear: hit the ground hard and fast, then get out alive. But the brothers weren't satisfied with just one prototype. They sketched out an even more ambitious version, Stubo-2. This was a bigger, heavier 2-seat variant that carried not 1 but 2 internal 500-kilogram bombs inside the fuselage. On paper, that meant devastating firepower. An attacker capable of delivering a 1-ton payload while still armored to the teeth. The performance numbers looked equally bold. A projected top speed of 560 kilometers per hour, a range of 2,000 kilometers, a service ceiling brushing close to 10,000 meters. For a ground attacker in the late 1930s, these figures sounded almost futuristic. But here's the catch. Numbers on paper don't always equal reality in the sky. The Stubo-2's design flaws stacked up quickly. The wings stayed the same size despite the added weight. The balance shifted rearward, making the aircraft unstable. And the already heavy design became even more sluggish, more dangerous to its pilot than to the enemy. What the Hüters had created was something that looked lethal in theory, but in practice was closer to a suicide machine. And yet, the story doesn't end here. Because while the HU-136 promised devastation on the battlefield, it carried within it a fatal flaw so crippling that even the Nazis couldn't ignore it. Fatal flaws. Everything that made the HU-136 bold also made it deadly for its own crew. Start with the simplest problem: sight. The pilot sat in a steel cocoon at the rear with a single narrow slit forward. No downward view. No wide-angle glass, no real way to judge altitude, angle, or a target beneath you. In combat, that's a fatal handicap. You can't aim what you can't see. Then there was the handling. Packed with armor and bombs, the little airframe behaved like a brick.
turns were sluggish, low-level maneuvering, exactly the sort of flying a ground attacker must do, became a struggle against inertia. Add in the rear-heavy balance of the Stubo 2 concept, and you get an aircraft that begged to stall or flip at the worst moment. Operationally, it was a nightmare. Training pilots to land once and land perfectly every time was asking too much. The eject the propeller landing system eliminated the option to abort an approach. No go-arounds meant no recovery if wind gusts, battle damage, or pilot error showed up at the worst second. Maintenance and logistics would have been brutal too. Armored panels make repairs slow, heavy prototype parts are hard to replace, and recovering jettisoned props in combat zones impractical. Taken together, these flaws didn't just make the HU-136 inefficient. They made it dangerous to operate and almost impossible to employ reliably in wartime conditions. Bold engineering had crossed the line into recklessness. The Reich Aviation Ministry could admire the concept, but when it came down to putting men and machines into the sky, admiration wasn't enough. And so, after the tests and drawings, the decision came, one that would decide the HU's fate and point the Luftwaffe toward a more practical path.
The rejection. When the Reich Aviation Ministry laid eyes on the HU-136 beyond the drawings, admiration quickly ran into cold practicality. Engineers could admire clever ideas on paper, armor where weight normally wouldn't fit, radical shortcuts meant to save mass. But war isn't an engineering thought experiment. It's logistics, reliability, and pilots coming home. The Luftwaffe already had options that, while less sexy on a blueprint, actually worked. The Henschel HS-129, for example, was heavy and specialized, but it could take off and land without flinging parts into the sky. Its pilot could see where he was going, and maintenance crews could keep it flying. That kind of dependable utility won contracts. Reports and test reviews, brutal but blunt, highlighted the HU's core problem. It asked too much of the pilot and offered too little operational benefit. Too blind to aim accurately, too heavy to maneuver effectively, and too risky to teach to new crews. It was the sort of machine whose theoretical strengths collapsed the moment you added fuel, bombs, and enemy fire. The ministry didn't banish the idea out of spite. They shelved it because the front needed aircraft that could be built, flown, repaired, and flown again under fire. So the HU-136 quietly slipped into the interesting failures drawer. Prototypes stayed on paper or in partial mock-ups, and the HS-129 and other practical attackers moved into production lines. But rejection didn't equate oblivion. The HU retreated from the front lines, yes, but it lingered in technical journals, in the scribbles of designers who kept asking, "What if?" and in the imaginations of anyone fascinated by extreme aircraft design. And that lingering curiosity is what brought the HU-136 back into the light decades later, because sometimes failure becomes a story worth remembering. Legacy and resurrection. Most experimental aircraft vanish the moment their projects are canceled, scrapped for parts, forgotten in archives, or buried in classified reports. But the HU-136 was different. Its sheer absurdity gave it a strange kind of immortality. Aviation historians couldn't ignore it, collectors couldn't resist sketching it, and model builders kept its odd silhouette alive in plastic and resin kits. In forums and books, the HU became the flying anvil that sparked endless debates. Was it bold genius or reckless madness? And then nearly 80 years after the project was shelved, the HU-136 stepped out of imagination and into reality. In 2017, a faithful replica was built in the United States. At the Military Aviation Museum in Virginia Beach, engineers and historians painstakingly recreated the aircraft, right down to its armored tail and narrow wings. This wasn't a machine built to fly. It was a machine built to remind people of how far inventors will push boundaries and how dangerous it becomes when practicality is sacrificed for boldness. Today, that replica sits as part of the German Experimental Aircraft Collection. Visitors who stand before it don't see a frontline killer. They see a grotesque, almost surreal machine, one that feels more like a warning than a weapon. Its blunt nose, its sled-like skid, the eerie absence of a cockpit canopy, all of it tells a story of ambition, failure,
and the razor-thin line between innovation and disaster. And in a way, that's why the HU-136 endures. It never flew in combat. It never destroyed a single tank, but it earned a place in history by showing just how extreme and how risky wartime engineering could become. So here's the question. If you were a pilot in 1938 and the Luftwaffe handed you the keys to the HU-136, would you have taken it into the sky or walked away before the propeller even spun? Let us know what you think in the comments. Because sometimes, the most dangerous aircraft aren't the ones that fought, but the ones that never should have.